The photograph stopped me in my tracks. I had been casually scrolling through an online auction archive, browsing old Coney Island memorabilia, postcards, ticket stubs, the usual fragments of nostalgia. And then I saw it. A glass box. Inside it, a baby. Tiny. Frail. Barely 2 pounds, its body curled and fragile in a way that didn't seem meant for the world yet. Behind the glass, a sign in bold letters read, "Living babies in incubators." And just beyond that, visible through an open doorway, the wooden frame of a roller coaster. The image was dated 1903. The baby was real. The roller coaster was part of Luna Park. And this exhibit, this living display, sat between a sword swallower and a performer known as Lionel, the lion-faced man. That single photograph pulled me into one of the strangest, most unsettling chapters in American history. For nearly half a century, from 1896 to 1943, premature infants were taken from hospitals across the country and placed inside glass incubators. Not in medical facilities, but at World's Fairs, amusement parks, and boardwalk sideshows. People paid 25 cents to see them, to stare at them, to witness their survival as a kind of spectacle. The man behind it all called himself a doctor. He wasn't. He claimed to have studied in places like Liège and Berlin, but no records back that up. He changed his name more than once, reshaped his identity, and invented much of his professional history. And yet, over 4 decades, he insisted he had saved more than 6,500 babies. Infants the medical system had effectively abandoned. The name he chose for himself was Dr. Martin Arthur Coney. He was born Michael Cohen in 1869 in what was then Prussian Poland. As a teenager, he immigrated to the United States. By 1910, census records didn't list him as a physician, but as a dealer in surgical instruments. He claimed to have trained under Dr. Pierre Boutin, a pioneer in neonatal care. But the timeline simply doesn't add up. Coney would have been too young, and already in America, when that training supposedly took place. And yet, somehow, this man, with no verified credentials, became the only person in the United States consistently saving premature babies. Not in hospitals, not in laboratories, in a tent at Coney Island, right beside the freak show. And here's where the story becomes impossible to dismiss as just a strange curiosity. In the early 1900s, American hospitals did not treat premature babies. Pause for a moment and really take that in. They didn't try. Premature infants were labeled weaklings, a term used without hesitation in medical journals. In 1901, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal openly questioned whether saving them was even worth the effort. 3 out of 4 premature babies died, and the medical establishment largely accepted that outcome. Even as late as 1939, a typical New York hospital might have only 1 incubator. Just 1. County, meanwhile, had dozens. His facilities ran around the clock. He employed 5 wet nurses and more than 15 trained medical staff who lived on site. His survival rate reached 85%, and he never charged the parents anything, not a single cent. Everything was funded by admission tickets, quarters dropped by visitors who wandered in after a day on the boardwalk, maybe after eating a hot dog, curious to see something unusual. Now, I know what you're thinking. It sounds exploitative. Babies displayed for profit. A fake doctor running what looks like a medical sideshow. And that reaction is completely understandable. In fact, organizations like the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children tried repeatedly to shut him down. Medical professionals dismissed him as a fraud, a quack, even accusing him of swapping babies. His nurses would sometimes slide a diamond ring over a baby's wrist to show just how small they were. He dressed recovering infants in oversized clothing to emphasize their fragility. It was theatrical. There's no denying that. But here's what that criticism often misses. The hospitals wouldn't do it. The technology already existed. Incubators worked. The knowledge was there. But the institutions that had the resources chose not to use them. Cooney's operation wasn't competing with medicine. It was filling a void left by a system that refused to act. And that refusal wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was rooted in ideology. And that's where this story takes a darker turn. Because while Cooney was saving babies in glass incubators at fairs and amusement parks, those very same fairgrounds were hosting something else entirely. Starting in 1908, at the Louisiana State Fair, a new kind of competition began to take shape. They called them Better Babies contests. Parents would bring their children, infants between 6 months and 4 years old, to be judged. The babies were measured, weighed, examined, and scored based on physical health, mental development, and appearance. The scoring system wasn't even subtle about its inspiration. It was modeled directly after livestock judging. One article from 1913 described it plainly. A physician evaluates a baby the same way an experienced judge scores cattle, horses, or hogs. By 1920, tens of thousands of babies had been evaluated in these contests across the United States. Women's magazines promoted them. A national Better Babies Bureau was created. Winners received medals, recognition, and public celebration. One child, a 3-year-old boy named William Charles Flynn, won 14 first-place prizes. Newspapers even reported that he had been matched for a future eugenic marriage with a 17-month-old girl who had scored just as highly. The headline read, "Mate Found for Perfect Boy." And if you're wondering, yes, these contests had a racial standard. African-American children were excluded entirely. The definition of perfect was designed to be white. But even these contests were just the polished surface of something much darker beneath. In November 1915, a surgeon in Chicago named Dr. Harry Heiselden was called to examine a newborn baby, Alan Bollinger, born with multiple disabilities. Heiselden made a decision. He refused to operate. He advised the parents to let the child die. Alan lived for 5 days and 8 hours. Afterward, the Chicago Commissioner of Health reviewed the case and testified that the condition had been treatable, that he personally would have performed the surgery. But it didn't matter. Heiselden defended his decision publicly. He even told reporters he had allowed at least 6 disabled infants to die, estimating that similar cases were happening at a rate of 1 per day in Chicago alone. A jury of physicians cleared him. Helen Keller wrote in support of his actions. And in 1917, Heiselden took it even further. He produced and starred in a film titled The Black Stork, a piece of propaganda that dramatized his philosophy. The promotional tagline read, "Kill defectives, save the nation." The film played in American theaters for over a decade. Now step back and look at the setting. The same decades, the same spaces. In one building, Martin County is fighting to keep premature babies alive inside glass incubators. In another, judges are scoring infants like livestock, assigning value based on their genetic fitness. Down the midway, eugenics exhibits explain why certain humans should be eliminated for the good of society. And across the country, in movie theaters, audiences are watching a film that argues some babies are better off dead. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was mainstream. Indiana passed the first compulsory sterilization law in 1907. By 1927, the United States Supreme Court upheld forced sterilization in the case of Buck versus Bell. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the now infamous line, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Between 1907 and 1963, More than 64,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States. Over 60% of them were women. The eugenics movement wasn't hiding in the shadows. It was winning. And the babies County was saving, fragile, premature, vulnerable, were exactly the kind of children this movement labeled as unfit, defective, disposable. Now widen the lens even further. During these same decades, from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, another system was quietly unfolding across the country. The orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children were taken from East Coast cities and transported by train to rural communities in the Midwest. The programs were run by organizations like the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Hospital. At each stop, the children were lined up and presented to prospective families. Witnesses described scenes that looked disturbingly similar to livestock auctions. Families would inspect the children, check their teeth, their posture, their strength, before deciding whether to take one home. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. As many as 25% of these children still had living parents. To keep track of them, some institutions sewed numbered tags into their clothing. Religious groups even ran separate trains, Catholic and Protestant, to ensure children were placed with families of the same faith. By the time the last orphan train ran in 1929, 250,000 children had been redistributed across the country. With almost no centralized records, no comprehensive database, most of these children never found their way back to their biological families. Today, it's estimated that around 2 million Americans are descendants of orphan train riders, many with no idea their family history passes through that system. And this is the point where I have to be careful, because what I'm about to suggest might sound like I'm connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. Maybe these are just separate events, parallel systems that happen to exist at the same time. Maybe there's no deeper pattern here. But consider this. In the early 1900s, across Europe and the United States, hundreds, possibly thousands, of postcards circulated depicting babies growing in cabbage patches, not as jokes, as birth announcements. In French, they were called faire part de naissance. These images showed babies being harvested from gardens, pulled from rivers, hatched from eggs, even delivered by trains. They were produced in multiple countries, in multiple languages, by anonymous studios. Famous artists like Salvador Dalí and André Breton collected them. The sheer volume of these postcards still puzzles historians. Some of them, when translated, reference ideas like repopulation, relocation, even the selling of babies. And they appeared during the exact same decades as the incubator exhibits, the orphan trains, the eugenics contests, and the sterilization programs. Maybe it's all coincidence. Maybe there's no hidden connection between a carnival sideshow saving infants in glass boxes, a medical system deciding which lives are worth preserving, a network shipping children across the country, and a flood of imagery depicting babies as crops to be harvested. Maybe. But once you start seeing the pattern, it becomes very hard to ignore. Because the pattern doesn't just sit in theory. It repeats itself in moments that feel almost impossible to explain away. On May 27, 1911, a fire broke out at Dreamland Park in Coney Island. It started during last-minute repairs on a ride called Hell Gate, just hours before opening. Within 20 minutes, 10 acres of the park were engulfed in flames. More than 80 animals died. A lion named Black Prince escaped, only to be chased along an elevated track and shot by police in front of a massive crowd. And inside the incubator building, smoke began pouring through the doorway, straight towards 6 premature babies. What happened next? feels almost surreal. Dr. Cowney and his nurses rushed inside. They wrapped each baby in blankets, one by one, and carried them out into the chaos of the burning park. And according to multiple accounts, the people who helped them weren't doctors. They were the performers. The same sideshow act society labeled as freaks stepped in to help rescue the infants. Early newspaper reports claimed the babies had died. They hadn't. All 6 survived. But instead of recognizing what had just happened, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children used the incident as ammunition. They argued that premature infant care should only happen in hospitals. By now, you can probably see the problem with that argument. Hospitals still weren't doing it, not for another 32 years. So in that moment, in the middle of a burning amusement park, the People's Society dismissed as outcasts saved the lives of children that the medical establishment had already written off. I've come back to that thought over and over again, and it never quite settles. Cowney kept going. He continued operating at Luna Park all the way until 1943, when Cornell Hospital in New York finally opened the first dedicated premature infant care unit in the country. And when they did, they used his methods, his techniques, his technology. They just didn't credit him. 3 years earlier, in 1940, Cowney had even tried to donate his incubators to the city of New York. The city refused. By the late 1930s, his exhibits were no longer drawing the same crowds. At the 1939 New York World's Fair, his display was a financial disaster. It had cost a fortune to build, but people weren't as fascinated anymore. Premature babies in incubators had stopped being a spectacle. The thing that had once saved his work now made it obsolete. He went bankrupt. Martin Cowney died on March 1, 1950, in Coney Island. He was around 80 years old. He had no money left. And by then, he was largely forgotten. His wife had died years earlier. His daughter, Hildegard, born 6 weeks premature in 1907, weighing just over 3 pounds, had once been treated in his own exhibit. She survived. She became a nurse. She worked alongside him for years. She never had children of her own. There are no direct descendants. And that's where the official version of the story usually ends. A strange footnote in medical history. A fake doctor who saved real lives. A feel-good story about one man defying the system. But the more I look at it, the harder it is to focus on just the man. Because the system around him raises questions that don't go away. A medical establishment that labeled premature babies as weaklings and let them die. A eugenics movement that scored infants like livestock and argued for eliminating the unfit. A propaganda film that told audiences to kill defective children for the good of the nation. A network of trains that relocated hundreds of thousands of children, many with living parents, with barely any records. And in the middle of all of that, one unauthorized showman, operating without credentials, saving thousands of lives using money collected from spectators who had just come from watching sword swallowers and human oddities. The questions that linger aren't the obvious ones. They're the uncomfortable ones. Where did thousands of premature babies even come from during a time when hospitals weren't treating them? How did a man without a medical license operate for 4 decades in a country that was simultaneously sterilizing tens of thousands of people for being genetically unfit? Why did institutions that had the knowledge and the technology refuse to use it, while just steps away, they were hosting competitions designed to produce better humans? And maybe the strangest question of all, what kind of society puts living babies in glass boxes at a carnival? Not because it doesn't care, but because it's the only place willing to. There's one more detail that stays with me. In the summer of 1934, Cowney organized a reunion at Coney Island for the babies he had cared for during the Chicago World's Fair the year before. Out of 58 infants, 41 returned, alive, healthy, carried in their mother's arms. Photographers were there. The New York Times covered it. And somewhere else in that same newspaper, in that same week, were articles discussing eugenics, debates about the strength of the American gene pool, arguments about which lives were worth preserving. The children in those photographs didn't know any of that. They just knew they were alive. Because someone whose real identity was never fully verified, had decided they were worth saving when no one else would. The buildings he worked in are gone now. The incubators were dismantled. The records are incomplete. But the questions remain. What happened to the children who were never counted? Who decided which lives mattered and which ones didn't? And what are we still missing about those decades, when babies could be classified as defective or perfect, displayed or discarded, shipped away or left to die, depending entirely on which door you walked through?